Welcome back everyone to this lecture. In this lecture, we'll be beginning our player scene, or our player to actually begin, existing in the world and moving around. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create our player by going to the world scene and we'll add a new node. Now don't worry if you've seen things done differently, because sometimes people will create a new scene in a different scene and they'll kind of save it, but we'll go through that whole process, so don't worry too much if you have seen something different. So let's add a character body 2D as our base node. This will be our base player node. Now in here, we can add a few things. The first thing we'll need, of course, is a collision shape, and then we'll need a player image. Now this image we'll be using tile 0085 or not. So let's actually find it. So we'll have to go into our tiles, and we're going to have to look for our player tile. Now, of course, you can pick whichever one you want, and it seems it's going to be in the tiny dungeon. So let's take a look if we can find it. All right, here we go. Okay, so it was underscore 005. That's why. Now, if we add this in, here we go. We can just drag our tile into the character body 2D. And if we head over to the transform, we can reset the position to make sure that it centers into the character body 2D as its parent. Now I can rename this by double clicking it and just typing in player. We'll save. Now we'll give it a collision shape of either a capsule or a circle. I'll give it a capsule. So now I can zoom in and just make it a little smaller here. And there we go. Now, if you want the capsule to show up in front of the player, all you would need to do is move the positioning of the tile behind it. Now, I'll leave it behind the player so I can see the sprite. Now, what we'll do is we'll save this scene as a separate scene, because sometimes you might see this little icon here that has kind of a play button. Now, I'll show you what that is. If we right-click this scene, the player specifically, we can save branch as scene. Now we can save this into our scenes folder, and we'll add a new folder called player. And any sort of scene that involves the player, so in the future we might add some GUI, some game user interface, stuff like that, that will go into the player. Now we'll have a similar thing for the script, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now what we can do is if we go into Open Editor, this will show our player scene in its own scene here. But the player is still here in the world. So anything that I change in this player will affect this player over here as well. Now I can move my player by going to move mode, and I can just move anywhere on the screen and move my player. Now do make sure we have the player selected in order to do that. Now we'll head back to the player and we'll add a player script. So let's put this in our scripts folder, and we'll create a new folder for him called player. We'll press open and create. Now here we have some code. Now in here, we don't have much, so we'll actually delete this for now. Next, what we can do is we'll create some variables because we're going to need some things to actually start moving around. Now the first thing we can do is we can export a variable called speed, and this is an integer, and we'll give it a value of 80 by default. Now the cool thing about export is that now if I go into my world scene, you can see here on the player script, it shows the exported variable, and I can change this, and it does affect the player. Now let's implement this so I can actually test it. So let's create a physics process function. And in here, what we'll do is we will say variable input vector is equal to vector 2.0. So essentially what we want to do is every physics process, we want to reset our input vector. Because now what we'll do is we'll call the input vector and say .x is equal to input dot get action strength, and we will say UI right for this one. And we're going to subtract right here. I'll actually pop our window screen out so I can touch this little guy right here to pop the code out so it's a little easier for you guys to see. And we will say minus input dot get action strength UI left. All right, now we can copy paste this and we'll do the same thing for the Y. Now what we'll do here is instead of up or down, we'll say, or sorry, instead of right and left, we'll say UI down for this one and UI up. Oh, up, there we go. Now you might be wondering, why is up on this side and down on this side? Well, let's explain it a little bit. In our world here, we have an X and a Y. Now the X is pretty default, right? So the positive is on the right-hand side and the negative is on the left-hand side. And you can see that up on the top with the negative numbers. So we have negative 100 here and positive 100. Now the Y-axis is actually upside down. Usually the positive is on the top and the negative is on the bottom. Now you might have seen or noticed that it is actually the opposite. It says 100 here, right? Positive 100 and then negative 100 up here. So it is flipped. Now in our script, the reason why we're doing this and what this does is the input.getActionStrength essentially returns a 0 or a 1, at least on computer. Of course, if this were to detect a switch or something, it might vary between 0 and 1. But for the case of our computer, if I press UI right, the right key, this will return 1. Now the cool part about this is that this input vector x is going to take this and say 1 minus 0. Because UI left, if I'm not clicking it, will give me 0. So what I'll get is 1 minus 0, and that will return 1, positive 1. And for the x value, that makes sense because I want to move to the right-hand side where x is positive. Now for the y, it's the opposite. Well, it's similar, but the opposite, right? So the UI down would be up, right? It would be positive. So it would be down in the sense of we're going downwards, right? You would think that it means up, but it's actually down. So there we go. We understand how that works a little bit. Now what we want to do is we want to say velocity is equal to input vector times speed. Now, it might make a bit more sense to see that this is a vector 2. So of course, we can kind of quantify it here as a vector 2. So now what we can do is test it if you'd like, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to work. Now, the reason it's not going to work is because we're trying to use velocity to move around. And this is a built-in variable inside of our character body 2D, but that's not going to exactly work because we're going to need something called move and slide. This will actually allow us to utilize the velocity and move and slide. So of course, if you left click or if you hold control and left click onto this function, sometimes it takes a few clicks, it will actually take us to the function and where it is. And you can see the documentation where it says character body 2D on the top left, and this is the function. And feel free to read it if you'd like, but the basic idea is that it actually allows us to use velocity. So we'll close the script here, and we can hit play, and I can now start moving around with my keyboard. There we go. Now, one last thing we'll do is we'll add a camera 2D and just zoom in a little bit. So at this point, we can zoom in as much as you'd like. I'm going to zoom in by 4, and now I'm going to hit play, and now we can move around. All right, there we go. So in this lecture, we went over adding our player, creating a new scene for it, creating a few new folders for our player, as you can see on the bottom left. We've also added some very simple movement for our player, implementing our player speed and player export. Right? You can test around the speed and change it to be whatever you'd like. And you can even test it to see that you can move slower or faster depending on this variable. In the next lecture, we'll be continuing our player and adding more setup to our player. So we'll be actually adding much more variables and kind of creating a lot of the things that we'll need to do things such as attacking, dying, those kind of things. So we'll be going over that into the next lecture. So I will see you all in the next lecture. Welcome back, everyone, to this lecture. In this lecture, we'll be continuing our player and just kind of setting up the general variables that we'll need in it. And we'll also kind of get started a little bit with the concept of what we're going to do next. So first, let's head over to our player and head over to the script folder. Now I'm going to pop mine out so it's a little easier to see everything. And I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see the code. All right, the first thing we'll do is we're going to create 3 main variables that will kind of allow us to implement the general logic of whether or not we're dying, whether or not we're attacking, or we're ranged attacking or melee attacking. So the first 3, there's just 3 variables, pretty simple. We're going to create a variable called dying, and this essentially will, it's pretty simple, right? It's a Boolean that if we are currently dying, then we don't want to do certain things. We do or do want to do certain things, right? So let's implement this Boolean, and we'll say this is false. Now, why are we doing this? Well, if I'm dying, I shouldn't be able to move. So, for example, what we can do is we can just say, if not dying, then we can do all this stuff. So that's one example of why we're creating this variable, right? Because when I start dying and I implement a animation for it or whatever, then I don't want to be moving, right? I don't want to be doing this stuff, right? And there's some other things that we may not want to be doing as well, right? So I may not want to be able to check to see if I can attack. I may not want to be able to, start moving my inventory, stuff like that, okay? Now the next one we'll create, the next variable is an attacking melee Boolean. Now this is we'll set it by false. Now this is similar to the dying one, right? In the sense that we want to know when I'm attacking. And the advantage to this is that, and we'll do this in a minute, well, not in this lecture, but we'll do this later, is we'll be able to add a cooldown to our attacking. So that way, like for example, when I start shooting things, I'm not going to want to just create 50 different arrows within a span of 1 second, depending on how fast I can click, right? Because at that point, people can kind of start exploiting our game. They can get clickers, right? So there's automatic clickers online that they can download. And obviously, there's a lot of exploits for that. So we'll add something called a timer that will allow us to essentially add a cooldown to our hitting. And we'll do the same thing for the melee attacking as well, but it'll work slightly different. But this is the general idea of why we're doing this. So next, we can add our attacking, you probably guessed it, ranged. And then similarly, it's a Boolean that will set equal to false. Now, we're going to add 2 more variables. Now, these ones don't really need much of an explanation, but I'll put them out, and maybe you can guess what we're going to do with it. Well, we're going to have a health and a damage variable. Okay? Now, these variables, oops, see, there we go. Don't want to get any errors there. These variables, well, you probably guessed it, are going to be for health to actually see how much health my player has whenever I take a hit and the amount of damage I do to other things. Now, this is something we'll keep for now, as once we implement the resources and the weapons and stuff, this might change depending on how we implement that. But for now, we'll keep this, as this is going to be very useful for something we do later. All right. Okay, so that is pretty much most of our setup. We have, of course, a few more variables that we'll be adding in the future, but this is the general gist of our player. So we have 3 variables to essentially keep track of what we're doing, and then 2 variables to, well, help us actually play the game a bit more, right? So health and damage. And of course, we'll be adding some similar variables like this into our monster as well. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. In this lecture, we've just begun our setup for the player. Now, in the next lecture, we'll be taking a look at how we create our melee attacking. We're going to start our melee attacking in the next lecture, where we'll be able to actually throw our sword out and kind of return it, and we'll use something called tweening. So I will see you all in the next lecture. Welcome back, everyone, to this lecture. In this lecture, we will be beginning our player where we can actually attack using a sword. Now, the first thing we'll do is we'll head over to our player, and we're going to need to add a few things into our player. So the first thing we'll add is something called a marker 2D. Now, this is essentially useful for actually kind of aiming things and using a position 2D, essentially. This will help us utilize certain positional things. Now, what we'll rename this to is weapon holder, or just weapon, or whatever you'd like. Now, essentially what we'll do in here is we'll have 2 main things in here, which will be the melee weapon and the ranged weapon. Now, we're going to create it so that it's dynamic, meaning it kind of will take certain damages depending on which one we equip. It will change its sprite depending on what happens with it, etc. So, okay, the first thing we'll do is we'll start with the melee. Now, how are we going to create a melee sword? Well, what we'll do is we're going to add something called an area 2D. Now, an area 2D is very good at essentially just checking for certain bodies. This will help us utilize the idea of having different monsters, different bosses, etc. And it will check to see if we hit or enter a certain area. Now, if we head over to the node section, we'll actually find not only area entered and stuff like that, but we'll also find body entered. Now, body is very specific to character body or in static body and rigid body. So it's any sort of body, right? And you'll understand this by seeing the word body in the node, right? So this is a character body 2D. Now, if there was another monster using a character body 2D, then we would be able to detect that using our area 2D. Now let's rename this to melee, and we will connect the body entered node signal into our player script. Now this will help us, find out if we actually hit something, which is very cool. So, okay, in here, this is where we'll actually do the damage. So we can pass for now, but I'll add another comment that says check for damaging monster. And we can pass to avoid the error that we would get. Now let's head back to our scene here, because there's some more things that we'll want to add and change. Because first we need to actually add a sprite, right? A sword that looks like a sword, right? So how do we do that? Well, first we can search up tile 104, tile. Okay, I'm just going to search up 104. That might help. There we go. Here is our sword that we'll be using. Now this sword, we'll put it into the melee. We'll go into the sword sprite, go to the inspector tab, go to transform, and we'll reset the position. Now for the rotation, I'm going to set it to 90 because I want it to be pointing towards my mouse, right? Now what we'll do is we're going to take the melee sword itself and drag it out a little bit, all the way right around here. Now what I want to do is I want to take my sword once again and drag it out a little bit. Now this is essentially where my sword will rotate. So this point that might be a little hard to see right here is the area 2D, and this is the sprite. Now I don't want the sprite to rotate. I want the melee sword, the area 2D to rotate around my player. Now what we'll do is we'll go to the melee and add a collision shape 2D to get rid of that error that we had. Now we'll give it a rectangle shape, and I'll just shape it to be the same size as the sword. All right, there we go. Now we have an actual area to check for our monsters and stuff. Now what we can do is actually make our sword rotate. Now how do we rotate? Now there's a bit of math that we could do to actually allow it to rotate, and you could totally look into some videos on that, as there are some complexities to it as well. But there is an easier way inside of Godot. Godot has utilized this stuff I'm talking about, this rotation, and implemented a function called lookAt. So what we can do is we can get access to this weapon holder or the weapon marker and essentially rotate that towards our mouse. So what we'll do is on the top of our script, let me just pop up our script here. We will create an onReady variable called weapon marker, and this will be equal to get node weapon holder. Now what we can do is in our physics process, inside of the if not dying, because I only want to rotate it if I'm not dying, I will say weapon marker dot look at. And that's it. Now we need to pass through a position to actually look at. And what we can do to look at is say get global mouse position. And that's it. Now if I minimize my game or minimize my script and play, you can now see I'm rotating. Now, of course, you may want to adjust your player depending on how you want this to rotate. Maybe you want it to rotate around its body instead of its head. It's really up to you. Okay, so at this point, you may try adjusting things to wherever position you'd like, but this is pretty good. All right, now what we can do is head back to our script, and we will head into the actual clicking. So we want to be able to detect if I actually click. Now, we're not going to do that just yet, but we'll set up the functions for it. So the first thing we'll do is create a function called attack check. and we're going to pass through delta. Now, this is not a built-in function that exists. This is something that we are creating, and we will pass through delta so that we can do things into this function. But for now, I'm going to pass. Now, in order to make this work, I have to call this in the physics process function. Now what I can do is I can just add this, let's say right under here. What we'll do actually is we'll put it under the weapon marker. And in here, we'll pass through delta. Not delta float, we don't want to say float, we just want to say delta. Now this delta is the delta from the physics process. And then we're going to just pass it through into the attack check. So that way this function gets called just as often as this. This essentially just allows us to manage our functions a little nicer and organize things, so it's not completely cluttered. All right. Now, we're not going to do this just yet, as we want to also set up some more targeting stuff and more input mapping. So we'll do that into the next video, and then we'll get started with our actual attack checking as well. So in this video, we have added our actual melee weapon and made it so we can rotate around our player. We utilized the look-at function for that, and we also auto-loaded our first or on-ready variable, our first variable. All right, and we also started our attack check to get that started for the next video. So in the next video, we'll actually be remapping some input so that we can actually create some custom-made inputs. For example, the UI right, I may want to use ASW instead, right? So we're going to implement that and see how we can do that inside of Godot. So I'll see you all in the next lecture. Welcome back, everyone. In this video and lecture, we will be remapping some inputs. All right, so let's get started right away. Let's head over to our project settings. So project settings, we'll go over to input map. And this is where any sort of input that I want to change will be mapped here. So I can add a new action, for example, walk right, walk left, walk down, and maybe walk up. We might also want an attack or a way to attack and a way to pause the game, which we'll add a little later. So I'm going to say pause. All right, now to create inputs into each of these, I'm going to press the plus button, and I can just click the key that I want to use. So for walk right, I will hit D. So we click OK, and we can just rinse and repeat for all of these inputs. So I'll just click ASW for all of these. Now for attack, I'm going to want to use the mouse button instead of using some sort of keyboard mouse. So I can't just click anywhere, right? This doesn't work. So I have to actually go to the mouse buttons and find the one I want, which is the left mouse button. So I'll select that and hit OK. And now for the pause, I'll just hit escape. You're more than welcome to use whatever else you'd like if you want to change up any of these. But now the cool part about this is if I close this and I go into my script here, and in the UI right here, I can change this to walk right, and I can change each of these to walk to the walks that I just inputted, right? So here I'll say walk left, and finally walk up. All right, now if I close the scripts, we play, we can now see I can move around using my ASW. And of course, I'm going to click, but nothing's going to happen because we haven't implemented the attack just yet. So let's close that, and we'll get right into that. So in this lecture, we just created input mapping for our player, and we'll just everything. So we've also created the pause inputs and attacks and stuff like that. In the next lecture, we'll be actually implementing the attack, right, with our new click input that we just added, and make it so when I click, what we'll do essentially is I'm going to take my melee attack here and bring it forward like so, and then back. So if I were to click right here, I want this position to move forward and backwards. Okay? So I'm going to just Control Z to move it back where it originally was, and that's it. So I will see you all in the next lecture. All right, welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we will be continuing the melee attacking with our player. All right, so let's head over to our script and pop this out. Now, in our attack check, what we'll do is, like I said from the last lecture, let's review it just a little bit. What we want to do is if I click right here, like so, I want my melee area 2D to essentially go forwards and backwards like so. So this is going to be achieved using something called tweening. Now, tweening is a very powerful tool that we can utilize to, well, essentially tween things. Now, the word tween has actually many definitions if you search it up, but in this case, it's going to kind of help us animate. So think of tweening as a way of animating. Now, that's not all tweening is for, because we can actually get started here and create the variable tween and say create tween. Now, if I say tween dot property, tween property right there, this is our tween. Now I can hold left and hold control and left click, and sometimes it takes a few tries. There we go. We can now find the tween documentation. Now there's some examples, and we'll actually do something very similar to these. And of course, I do recommend you actually try reading this, specifically the tween property. Now, essentially, all we'll do is we're going to tween the position, right? So we have a few things that go into here that we'll be using. So the first one is the object, and the object in our player is going to be the area 2D here, the melee, right? So we'll take a look at how to pass that through as an object in just a minute, and then the property. Now, if we look at the example here, we can see that this property is passed through as a string, right? It says position, and that's what we'll do too. We'll also have final value. So the way this works is that it'll take the current position and tween it to the final value that we give it. And then it will finally take a duration, which is just how long this entire animation or tweening will take. All right, so in our player, let's take a look at how we'll do that. Now, in order to get access or pass through the object melee, we want to say get node right here, weapon holder melee, and that's it. Now we'll add our colon right here again. And now we'll go to the property. Now, which property do we want to tween? Well, we want to tween the actual position, right? And we can do that by just passing through position, like so. And now what we'll do is we can just take the target position or pass through the target position times 10. But the question is, what is target position? Well, that's something that we haven't created yet, but let's just finish this tweening and we'll pass through the number 0.2 for the time. Now for the target position, we're going to want to essentially tween this to our target position. So how do we do this? Well, what I'll do is I'll create a new variable called target position. And to do this, we'll create a variable called target position. Whoops. Target position. I might just copy paste it. There we go. And this is going to be a vector2. Now, how do I know this? Well, essentially, all this will be is we're going to get the global mouse position, and we're going to subtract the position of this guy, or the marker, so the weapon marker, minus, or the global position of that. Global position. So we're going to subtract the global position of the mouse to the marker. And this will essentially get the target or the direction of where my target position is going to be. Okay? Now, this is how we create tweening, but there's kind of an issue. The issue is that this attack check is supposed to be happening constantly. And this is not exactly what we want to do in terms of a tween. Now, a tween, what we want to do realistically is we want to create its own function. So we'll create a new one called melee attack, and this will pass through a target position. We can just say target pose. And now what we can do is copy paste this that I just wrote and put it into this new function. All right. Now what we can do is pass through this function, this new function, through here. And of course, I'll pass through the target position that I'm getting. Now, the target position, here I have to change it to the function. So this tweening will be called whenever I actually attack. Now you can imagine that will actually attack if I press the attack button. So I'll say if input dot is action just pressed attack, then I want to do all this. Okay? So this is how we will essentially tween our position. Now, this probably doesn't work just yet, so there's more to it. So let's take a look at how we'll do this. Now, just remember, there is one more thing we need to do, right? Now, that thing that we need to do is also say attacking melee is true. We need a way to keep track of if the attacking melee is true, and that is right here, right? So when I call this function, when I call this function, that means I am now attacking. But now there's a problem. Well, how do I return, right? How do I essentially go back to false? Because this will actually tween our position outwards, but how do I go back to the default position? Well, there's another function inside of tween called tween callback. And this allows us to call a function. Now, for example, in fact, if we actually left control and left click here, it will give us an example. This one is a callback here. There is one good example that is not here. It might be at the top. That is queue free. See if we can find it right here. Here we go. So right here at the top, this is a really good example. Well, where when this property is all done, all this stuff is done, it will queue free the sprite. Now we're not going to queue free, but we're going to call something called return default. Now this is a function that we have to create. So let's create this function called return default. And what this will do is actually do the exact same thing. So we'll copy paste the tweening stuff and go back to this. And we'll remove this callback though, because we don't want that. Now instead, what we'll do is we're going to return to the default position of our original sword, right? Now in the target position, instead of target position, what we'll do is we'll say vector2.0. Now the reason we want to do this is essentially we want to return our marker back to its original position. However, you may notice that this may not work because we're actually moving the melee weapon, the melee itself. So what we'll do instead is we'll change this melee weapon to just be the weapon marker. Now, this is why, or this is essentially going to show the same thing, but instead of the actual melee weapon, we're just going to move this marker, and it gives the same effect, right? So now back into our script, we can now take a look at what we're doing. So we're attacking. Now we're going to pass to the vector target position, and then we're going to attack here by tweening it, and then we're going to return default. Now there's one more thing we need to do, which I would encourage you to figure it out, which is we want to attack melee as false. Now, this won't work perfectly because what we want to do is we actually want to use something called await. Now we're going to await get tree.create timer, and we're going to pass through 0.5. Now this is essentially a cooldown for our sword, right? So now I can't just constantly click if this hasn't happened yet, right? Because now what I can do is up here, I can say and not attacking melee. Okay, so let's test this out and see if we get any bugs. We'll hit play, and if I click, nothing's happening. So let's try to figure out what's going on. Now, we'll actually do that in the next video where we debug this together, because debugging is a very good skill to have. So we'll end this lecture. Now, in this lecture, we learned basically tweening and how tweening works with several different functions. Now, in the next lecture, we will go over debugging and how we're going to debug this together. All right, so I will see you all in the next lecture.